Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to reintroduce to you now. Stephen Thomas is a returning guest on our show. Check out his first appearance on episode 394 of Boundless Body Radio. Stephen Thomas, known online as the UK Carnivore, debunks and dispels many popular myths about nutrition, fitness, and aging. In the past, while eating a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, Stephen was a semi professional soccer player, won a singles tennis tournament, and had run several middle distance races. But his health was poor, and as he experienced frequent colds and struggled with several other health issues. Stephen eventually learned about low carbohydrate diets and decided to try it himself. The switch was a big improvement from eating a high carbohydrate diet that he had been eating for his entire life. Still, on low carbohydrate, results were not as good as he wanted. Stephen continued to lower his dietary carbohydrate intake as he moved towards being a fitter athlete and is currently much healthier on a carnivore diet. On carnivore, his body fat percentage dropped and his muscle mass increased. His prediabetes, athlete's foot, and facial and skin rashes are gone, and he has more energy and is stronger than he's ever been. You can find Stephen online by searching on social media UK Carnivore. Stephen Thomas, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
I am so excited to be back, and I was flabbergasted. Oh, flabbergasted. There's an English word. That it was 2 years ago I was on. I can't believe it. So what number
Two
episode
plus
would this
years.
be?
Oh
Yeah.
my goodness. So we have continued releasing episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and sometimes on
Wow.
Saturdays and Sundays. So we're up to like this will be somewhere in the high 700s. So it's been a few episodes that we've done, but yeah, I can't believe it either. It's been over 2 years. And in preparation, it's always fun to kind of like go back and listen to the original episodes that we did together. And yeah, we've got a lot to catch up on, my friend. You've been quite
Mm.
busy in the last 2 years, and it's always good when somebody decides to go on a carnivore check. I feel like I need to do a wellness checkup on them to make sure they're still feeling okay. Do you feel the signs and symptoms of a heart attack coming on anytime soon? Have you felt a lack of pooping from not eating any fiber, or do you still feel like your health is okay these days?
I think it's better than it's ever been. In your little introduction, then, I also had a coronary artery calcium scan when I was high carb, and it was 639. So you just jogged my
Oh my
memory about,
goodness.
yeah, about the heart health. Um, and I'm actually speaking to someone about getting a retest done very, very soon. Actually, we run a school community. When I say we, that's myself and Richard Smith, who's the Keto Pro, who you might have interviewed.
Yeah.
Yeah, we run a community called the School Community, and one of the members has actually alerted us to a CAC walk-in place where you can do it in Manchester. So maybe I'll be able to do a retest, because I've been worried about a retest because I don't want to jump the queue for the NHS. I don't want to do that when because I've got a little bit of money to do the retest. I don't want to jump in front of, a huge waiting list. But anyway, yeah, that's exciting. I haven't got scurvy. Absolutely not. So I think Carnivore is sort of working for me, and everyone I deal with is doing really well. But I think in the 2 years, a few things have changed in the way I operate. I still obviously do the personal training for people, much less rehab. I've written a couple of books, one which is about blood tests, because I did a decade with private blood testing labs. And some of that was when I was high carb, and then some of it was low carb. So I can look at results in different sort of fields, really. And I realized that the carnivore way of eating, especially, maybe keto a little bit, low carb a little bit, the normative ranges in bloods are just not really pertinent for some of the markers when you're carnivore. So, for instance, things like T3, which you need a lot less of when you eat this way, because T3 is needed in moving pyruvate across the mitochondrial membrane. So we don't do glycolysis. We eat a lot more protein and fat, so we don't need T3 as much. So that's just one example out of many. And iron markers are very different. We should have slightly higher ferritin because we've got longer living red blood cells. So I was so bored with telling people the same thing, and probably worried that they're getting bored hearing the same thing. I wrote a book about that. So that's called the Complete Guide, or the Guide to Blood Tests in the Context of Keto, Low Carb, and Carnivore. And I think that's been the biggest thing. I've realized that we're saying the same things. Casey, I think, you've had some great guests on, and however great they are and however big their following is, there's still some things that always get thrown at us. The lack of vitamin C, for instance, which is not even true. and we need a lot less of it, because when you're converting non-heme iron to heme iron, which is what happens when you eat a lot of plants, you need a lot of vitamin C, because the vitamin C ferroreductase enzyme requires it. Well, we don't require it because we eat heme iron. So there's such a big thing that we constantly have to address. I know you laughed when I said about scurvy, for instance, but it's still out there. And yet there's all these carnivores not getting scurvy. There's absolutely zero evidence of that. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's a really good thing to point out to people, because everybody kind of inherently knows, the story about the sailors and the first really like randomized controlled study that was ever done with citrus fruits that helped the sailors. But really, it was a lack of fresh meat that they weren't having on these longer voyages. And it does give people pause to say, like, look, we've been eating only meat for as long as we have. I'm coming up on my 6-year, carniversary, and like I still don't have scurvy, and I feel great. Like, what's going on if I'm not having the limes and the oranges and citrus fruit like for like people here? I think it's absolutely fascinating that you're talking about blood work in the context of a carnivore diet. So I definitely want to talk about that, and some of the things you learned along the way. But I did want to start out by reminding the listeners a little bit about your story. And I feel like when we heard your story the first time, we kind of cut to the part where you just weren't feeling that well. And I wanted to go back a little bit about your upbringing and capture a little bit more about your story, going back to the beginning, and maybe some of the root causes to, what you felt was, you're obviously very fit. You accomplished a lot as far as fitness goes, but your health seemed to struggle a lot. So I wondered if we could capture that story today.
Yeah, I mean, I've just worked out, hence being a little bit glowing at the moment. I think this is the thing. If I was to go back to when I was 25 and very, very fit and eating lots of carbohydrates, I wouldn't believe me. And I can remember flicking through a bodybuilding magazine. I mean, I have done a bodybuilding tournament, completely natural, by the way. Hence, I wasn't big and bulky like a bag of walnuts. But, and I can remember even then they would talk about maybe try a high-fat diet, and I just ignored it completely and utterly. I didn't take any notice. But I suppose you can get your little violins out now, because my mum died of colon cancer, my dad died, and a girlfriend died. Now, that was in my 20s, and my mother, she basically made the decisions for food, and we followed the food guidelines to a T. So when they came in 1977, I mean, literally, I didn't touch red meat. I was born 1964, so I'm 60 now. And, I didn't have red meat. I didn't have saturated fat in anything. I was eating sort of porridge oats, which the Americans call oatmeal, lots of fruits, lots of veg, and so was she. That's very important. Bran, we've got a cereal called Bran Flakes, and it was loads and loads of fiber. She died of colon cancer. So all the things allegedly that are great and stop you getting colon cancer, she did, and she got colon cancer. And she didn't do any of the things that give you colon cancer, allegedly, like red meat, saturated fat, all that. So yeah, when she died, I'd already lost my dad, and then I lost a girlfriend to breast cancer. I didn't think nutrition had anything to do with it. I now realize that, if I knew then what I know now, maybe things would have turned out differently. And I had bits and pieces that were going wrong, although I was really quite athletic and doing well at sport and great at squash and, all to a good standard. I did have aches and pains, even in my 20s, and then I had a very severe back pain on a squash court, and I was taken off sort of on a hard board. And I can remember the two paramedics. One had back pain, and he was very sympathetic, and the other person never had back pain, didn't know, just thought I was being, in those days you could say this, just being a big girl, man up and all this sort of stuff. So I went to hospital, and I was shown a very convincing x-ray and told by the time I'm 50 I've been in a wheelchair. That was it, categoric. Of course, I'm 60 now. I still play five-side soccer, although maybe I play like I'm in a wheelchair. But, I've never seen a wheelchair. I've not been in a wheelchair. That didn't happen. But I was very convinced. And I suppose now I'm looking at how people come to me and they still believe what their doctor tells them, how compelling it can be. Because I've lived that. I was told that. I was shown x-rays that this is your hip. This is it. You can't do this. And that was, fast forward. I know you want my story, but I'll just keep that thread going. I can remember in my 40s, before I became an obesity and diabetes specialist practitioner, I was told that, diabetes is chronic and progressive. So you believe that? You absolutely believe it. And that was, I was still an advanced personal trainer at the time, and I was going to train someone that wanted to get to the Olympics who was a type 1 diabetic. And that's when my sort of qualifications in this field started in earnest, really. So through my 20s and 30s and early 40s, I did literally outrun a bad diet. I looked great. I felt okay. Now I look back, I didn't feel okay. There were things that were wrong. There was athlete's foot. There was, my skin was terrible. My forehead was terrible. I mean, this is 60-year-old skin, 10 years low carb keto. It's much, much better now. My teeth were ruined from having a high carb diet, absolutely ruined, and so anyway, when I got to in my 40s, and I was doing middle distance running, hence the medals up there, I just thought, well, I'm going to get qualified. I'm going to learn all this stuff. And that's also when the bloods came in, because once I started to learn about this stuff and I started to do the rehab clinics, I was getting nowhere with people that were following my advice, which was, the mainstream advice, dietetics, the dietitian's advice of 6 meals or 3 meals, 3 snacks, keep your blood glucose up, all that rubbish. And people weren't getting anywhere. So I was in my 40s. I was all newly qualified. I was thinking I was doing great. And yet the people that were doing really well, which was maybe 1 in 10, were coming in, and I was saying, wow, what are you doing? And they all say to a person, we're ignoring you. That's what was happening. And of course, it wasn't Carnivore then. It was Atkins, or it was, low carb. They didn't say keto, or they just said they're dropping the carbohydrates, eating more meat, whatever. And it took me, and I'm really embarrassed to say this, about 5 years to actually realize that I'd got it all wrong. But I did. I realized. And this is what annoys me about so many influencers out there. I won't name drop, but everybody knows who they are. They're constantly, on the case of Carnivore, defending things like statins and lowering your LDL and absolutely ridiculous advice, because they haven't got it in them to say, do you know what? There's too much proof that maybe we're slightly wrong. So that really frustrates me. I won't rant about that too much. So when I got to my 50s, I started low carb, and for my own personal journey, and also for the people I was seeing, it was life changing, absolutely life changing. And all of a sudden, this chronic progressive type 2 diabetes wasn't that. It was a reversible condition. All you had to do was stop eating carbohydrates. I mean, literally, that's it in a nutshell. And to me, it's so obvious. If you are taking your daily blood glucose readings, and every time you eat carbohydrates, it puts it through the roof, and therefore it's going to increase your insulin, and then you will have a crash. Then you feel hungry again, and you constantly do that left, right, and center every single day. You're going to have problems with managing blood glucose levels. And the easiest thing to do in the world is to not raise them in the first place. So that was it. Once I realized that we can actually, pass a common sense test, it became relatively easy to talk to people about it. And, there's all this rubbish all around it. We should be eating fruit and veg. Well, why? I mean, 70% of the average person's diet is fruit and veg. Even if it's potatoes, all right, 70% is carbohydrate. That's what it is. And then people say, well, it's not fresh fruit and veg. Well, carnivore has not been popular for a long, long time. Keto hasn't been popular for a long, long time. It doesn't mean it's not the right diet. It's not a fad, but it's not been immensely popular. Low carb hasn't been immensely popular. And yet diseases, heart attacks, diabetes, bipolar disease, mental health have all skyrocketed. Well, it can't be that and colon cancer and things like that, it can't be that the only people with those conditions are carnivores or people following keto, because there's not enough of us. So it must be the people that aren't eating that. And, to me, it just seems ridiculous, because you can stand back and say, well, what's happened? Well, since 1977, since the food guidelines came in, since that's happened, we've reduced our intake of butter, we've reduced our intake of red meat and meat in general, and we've increased our carbohydrates, and we've increased our fruit and veg intake, and it's been a disaster. That's an absolute nailed on epidemiological, real world experience. There is way too much diabetes. Now, when I started, diabetes wasn't common. It was unusual. there's still enough people to have a clinic, but I was only having maybe like 10 people a week. And it certainly wasn't kids, and it certainly wasn't people in their 20s, unless it was type 1 diabetes. And now I'd be inundated. I'd be absolutely inundated. And there lies the rub. You see, I was doing it as what's called a GP referral thing. So, I wasn't paid a king's ransom, and it wasn't like if you've got 100 people, you're going to get 100 times as much as one person. But it is a money-making thing. If you're selling, and I actually do think we can say selling medications, even if you don't think you're selling medication, the doctors aren't selling medications, they get an honorary. They get the pharmaceutical companies saying, here's a pat on the back, thank you so much. Your average patient's cholesterol, LDL, has been lowered, and therefore we're rewarding you for good work. It's not commission, it's not payment, but it is. So there's no incentive to get people to do things that cost nothing, like a good diet. And I am actually got to, getting to the point where I think if people really genuinely think that modern medicine is in it to cure you, then they need to wake up. There's public record. There's Goldman Sachs telling the pharmaceutical industry, it's not a good business model to cure people. You've got to stop doing that. You've got to manage disease. You've got to keep them diseased, so they need the medications. That's public record. That's out there. Absolutely out there. And that's not how I work. I had a coaching client this morning, yesterday, this is the last session. You don't need to do this anymore, because that's what your aim is to make them completely not needing to pay any money for anything. And it's so simple. It really is so simple, but it's made complicated, and people in the mainstream don't want to tell you because it's all full of conflicts of interest.
Yeah. I just finished listening to a podcast episode that came out yesterday at the day of this recording. Not going to name the name, but think of a very popular American longevity author, doctor who does very lengthy interviews, and he interviewed an expert all about insulin resistance. And this interview went 2.5 hours long. It was very in depth, and the amount of time in a 2.5 hour podcast dedicated to nutrition when dealing with insulin resistance and diabetes was so embarrassingly low. They hardly mentioned it. They mentioned it 2 or 3 times, but never went into any depth or never tried to identify the problem. They were talking about doing genetic testing to figure out who is genetically, predisposition to be insulin resistant. And they talked about, in a lot of cases, triple therapies. So not just one medication, but 2 or 3, including semaglutide, very expensive medications. And it's crazy that you can have a discussion about insulin resistance with an expert in insulin resistance who literally studied under George Cahill, who was doing studies on fasting back in the 60s and 70s and identifying that the body can run perfectly well 40 days fasted on ketones and fatty acids. And they hardly mention nutrition. Like, you could just start with nutrition. And yes, we do have pharma, and there are pills. Maybe they might help some people sometimes short term, but like, how you can have a discussion for that long and not discuss nutrition as it relates to insulin resistance is mind-boggling to me. So when you say conflicts of interest, I definitely smell a rat where that comes from. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, and I think that the belief in genetics is absolutely ridiculous as well, because there's a big tie to nurture, not just nature. So when you're looking at genes, well, you share your genes with your parents and your grandparents, et cetera, but you also share their eating habits. So it's still epidemiology. It's still association. It's still saying, well, look, this gene here seems to be associated with type 2 diabetes. Yeah, right. That's true. And your kids have got type 2 diabetes. Yeah, is that true? Yeah, that's true. Right. Okay. But do they eat the same as you? Have they been brought up in your house eating the same foods? Well, yeah. Okay. So maybe, just maybe, it isn't the genes. And this is the other thing I was going to say, because this is what happens. You might get a family, and this is absolutely nailed on what happens, is they'll come and let's say it's a young lady, and she'll say, oh, my brother's got diabetes, my mum's got diabetes, my dad has got diabetes, I'm pre-diabetic, what can I do? So we put them on the right diet. And lo and behold, they don't get diabetes, and they start to control their blood glucose. I haven't at any point removed all the genetic code from that person, right? So it's the same genes, but lifestyle has changed it so that you get into the realm of epigenetics. So I think I am actually I'm a scientist. I've got an honours degree in science, in physiology and health sciences. But I tell you, I'm not sold on genetics and the connections they make to diseases. Yes, there are some strong connections to certain medical conditions. Sickle cell might be one, for instance, but even then it's confounded by your sort of the ethnic base that you're looking at and where you're living. So I just feel it's not a very exact science to be quoting in interviews that take 2.5 hours, because it's not nailed on. And also then I'm looking at the fact that many people who have this propensity, predisposition to be diabetic are actually being nurtured in a household where they're eating the wrong things. And so it is still epidemiology, yeah, and it's actually laughable. And then also when they identify the gene, that's not nailed on as well, because it could be an associated gene later on in the code. You know, and I use this analogy that, you know, if there's 10 people in a classroom and, you know, one of the children is always causing lots and lots of trouble, and then they get known for that, causing that trouble, and then you see that, oh, I could start some trouble here and get away with it because it's associated with him. So, I mean, that's such a silly example, but that is literally what we're looking at, that there is interactions between genes that we don't know enough about. We absolutely do not know enough about, and it's just not understood what's really going on. So I think I would be very cross to watch something for 2.5 hours about diabetes and think, you've spoken about food for 10 minutes. Wow.
If only they had spoken about food for 10 minutes. It was a lot closer to 1 minute, if any, and no details, like nothing. And it's like, but you could start with that, and then again, like if you need to prescribe medications, sure, go for it. But like you're missing such a big component. So yeah, I appreciate that insight, and I agree. Like our genes have not changed in such a short amount of time. When the blatantly obvious thing that has changed, like you said, 1977 was the dietary guidelines. And I have to say, like I said before, I went back and listened to our original episode, and there was one thing that stood out to me, and I didn't need to go back to listen to it because it stood out to me so much since then. And Stephen, I haven't actually told you this, but when you were telling me originally 2 years ago about some of the niggling things that you were dealing with, including the athlete's foot, it really hit home to me that, like, oh yeah, like, why haven't I injured my shoulder? I used to injure my shoulder all the time. Why haven't I gotten a cold in 6 years of being carnivore? I used to get at least one cold every year that would knock me out for a few days. The athlete's foot thing, you were telling me about all the lengths that you would go to, including urinating on your feet, which is what you're told. I used to do that too because I always had athlete's foot. And now I don't. It just like magically went away and I never get sunburn. And I just thought it was such a standout moment, like all the little niggling things that people think are normal or they think it's part of aging. And I'm looking at you, I cannot believe you're 60 years old. You look maybe 40. You look like you're in amazing shape. You talk well, you speak well, like all these amazing things with health benefits. And I think people don't understand the little niggling things, like I said, that really accumulate that you just kind of think, oh, it's just aging. But on a carnivore diet, you really can get rid of them and they don't necessarily come back ever. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's the absence of something is very difficult to notice, actually. And that's the thing. I mean, I used to do a lot of rehab. I had lower back specialism. I was really interested in it. The sad thing about me is I like to know. So when I was told I'd be in a wheelchair, I went and studied the spine, and then I went to an osteopath who said, wow, you really know your stuff. You should be qualified. So then I did that, and I did advanced spinal manipulation, and I did advanced medical acupuncture, which can actually be used under the NHS when people are going through cancer pain. So it isn't like all woo-woo. And I really got interested in that. So one of the things that would happen, I would do a rehab clinic. I used to do a Tuesday and Thursday rehab clinic where I was doing the bloods as well. And people would come in, and because I kept notes, I'd say, how's that shoulder pain? And there'd be literally, yeah, I haven't had it. They completely didn't realize that it had gone. Now, you notice pain. So you notice the things you notice are the things you notice, but you don't notice the absence of them. And yeah, thank you for that. I mean, the athlete's foot, yes, I went through great things. That's not what caused it, by the way. If people didn't hear the first interview, I wasn't urinating on my feet all the time. That was a cure that somebody suggested, which I tried, and I had it for like 35 years, and I wasn't doing that particular cure for 35 years. I was trying duct tape and acids and putting powders in my socks and shoes and everything, doing everything. Hair dryer between my toes, so really, really dry. Now I'm carnivore. I can train, have a shower. It's just easy. It's just easy, and it doesn't come back ever. It doesn't ever come back, and unless I do something stupid, which was about 6 months ago when I did a continual glucose monitor experiment purely for YouTube, purely to show that the things like 40 grams of oats will spike your blood glucose. 20 grams for me did, actually, and that messed me up. Once I did 2 weeks of live experiments with glucose, and I obviously did it properly. I had carbohydrates leading up to it and carbohydrates coming off of it. That messed me up, and I would have to say that this is what happens when I'm coaching people. They say, well, I'm 10 days into it, and then I went out with my friends and I had a pizza and all this sort of stuff, and I feel awful. And I'm like, yeah, you will feel awful, but it's a good reminder of how bad these things really are for you. Because when you're constantly doing that, your body sort of adapts and does a workaround and makes it. The body is remarkable. It will get you through stuff. But once you take the things away, it doesn't want them back again. So it literally says to you, buddy, you dumped all this stuff and now you're putting it back into your body. Can we just remind you how bad this is and how much effort it takes to bring your blood glucose down and bring your insulin down and repair your skin? And it is remarkable, actually, how dangerous some of the people out there are. I mean, I just did a thing with the Kent Carnivore. I don't know, have you had Lee Copus on your show?
No, I don't think so.
I thoroughly recommend him. Now, he's had his colon removed. He was told to eat lots of fiber, fruit and veg and all that, to the point where he lost his colon. He's in his 20s, right? He's got a bag.
My goodness.
And, so he can actually tell you if when you eat meat, it doesn't end up in the bag. I can cut veg up, he says. I can make it into the shape of a triangle. I look in my bag, there's that triangle of veg. It's not digested. So all this stuff about meat rotting in your colon, absolute rubbish. He's got a bag, he can prove it. But I knew this anyway because I dealt with nurses that were dealing with ostomy bags and colostomy bags, and they all said the same thing. It's never meat, it's always plant material in there. So there's so many people out there telling you dangerous things which can be easily disproven with common sense. Because if meat rotted in your colon, it would be in his bag. It would be in other people's bags. It never is. It's always veg, always fruit, always seeds, always nuts. All the stuff you're told is healthy are always undigested and in the bag. And fiber is absolutely one of the worst things in the world you can possibly have. And the first 5 years of me being a diabetic specialist, I now realize the only reason they like fiber is it hides, and this is the point I was making, it hides the blood glucose spikes a little bit, but it doesn't do any good. It's still a lot of sugar. It's indigestible. So yeah, your blood sugar might look slightly better, but your health overall is going to be worse. You're going to get bloating. You're going to, have a lot of gas, intestinal distress. So yeah, thanks for asking me about my athlete's foot. But yes, and I don't know how I ended up with fiber, but yes.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I recently hosted somebody on our show who is very much pro fiber and pro vegetable. And I like to give people space to talk about their truth and what works for them. And it was totally fair. I didn't want to press him, but I did want to ask him, like, okay, well, when I Google search, anybody can do this. You can Google search who is a low fiber diet recommended for, because low fiber diets are recommended for certain people. And the first thing that comes up is a list of all of these digestive issues: IBS, IBD, Crohn's disease, leaky gut. They're all digestive, diverticulitis. It's all digestive stuff. And the recommendation is to go on a low fiber diet. So how is it possible that we're recommending a high amount of fiber and a high amount of vegetables to people, but then we don't if they have digestive issues? Well, how did they get those digestive issues to begin with? Like it just makes absolutely no sense to me. And I asked him about that. He had an answer, and it was it didn't convince me. I understand where he's coming from. And again, I don't want to take away anybody's truth, but I I don't think of it as anything helpful. And when I'm trying to explain to people that not only are vegetables not that good for you, but they can actively be pretty bad for you in a high volume, and most people are better just getting them out.
Yeah, and I think I like the way you say that. You don't want to deny people's truth, because that's what I was trying to say. When I was 20, 23, that would have been my truth. I now realize it wasn't my truth. That wasn't actually what was happening. I was out training or out running or just being young enough to stay insulin sensitive. So maybe that person in 15 years' time can come back and answer the question, and probably differently. But I'm really big on that. If someone says to me, well, I've been a vegetarian for 50 years or 15 years and I feel great and fantastic and my bloods look good, that's fine. I have no problem with that. I'd never argue with someone about, well, maybe that is a bad diet for you, because clearly it isn't. It's worked out for that person. Whether there is something going on in the background, whether they're going to have more problems as they get older, maybe dementia because there's not enough fats for their brain health. It just sounds like you're being really mean. So I don't go down that route. But I do feel that any diet that has to be supplemented, firstly, is acknowledging it's deficient in the first place. But it's also the way that it's presented to people that annoys me, because most of the studies, when the sort of high carb, high fiber people talk about studies, they always use relative risk, which always exaggerates the difference. Whenever you ask them for the raw numbers or the absolute risk, even though risk can't be can't actually be claimed anyway with associative data, they don't like it. I did a video recently where the relative risk of eating red meat and raising type 2 diabetes, which is laughable anyway when you look at, well, what's the possible mechanism there? The risk was increased by 62%. Now, that sounds scary, but then when you look at the actual numbers, and it was quite good, because there was a quintile where they didn't eat much red meat, and a quintile, the top one, where they ate the most. And we looked at the person years. It was like 1 million person years of follow-up in both quintiles. When you boiled it down, the difference was in the low meat intake, it was 3 out of 1,000 people. 3 out of 1,000 people got type 2 diabetes. And in the high meat intake, it was 5 out of 1,000, which is a minuscule difference. But of course, the difference between that is 2, isn't it? There's 2 extra people. Well, 2 is 60% of 3. So you can say it's a 62% increase. But I tell you what, if we went out tomorrow to get lottery tickets and we were allowed to get 1,000 each, and you got 3 and I got 5, out of our possible 1,000, right? Would you say to me, well, Stephen, you really bucked it, mate? I mean, you've got such a big increase of chance here because you bought 2 extra tickets out of your 1,000. It'd be like, well, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's just so annoying, because 62% sounds really scary, but 3 out of 1,000 compared to 5 out of 1,000. And also that particular study, there is a conflict of interest. It's been, they even declare their conflict of interest. So that's the best they can come up with in 1 million person years of follow-up. It's just, wow, that's not convincing at all to me. Yeah. So I think that's my biggest problem at the moment, is the misinformation from the influencers on the other side, that they pick and choose when they use relative risk if it helps them. And if in the main, what they tend to do is, if there's something that shows that meat is good, then they'll use absolute risk, because it serves their purpose. Whereas I'm just, here's the numbers. Here are the numbers. But also, what tops everything? Clinical experience, real experience, what you just said, the real truth, the person's truth. If I have 1,000 clients, which, luckily got over last year to 1,000 clients, I've never seen any of them get scurvy. None of them have got kidney disease. I've had people reverse kidney disease. Well, that's true. That's what actually happened. I don't need studies. And it's so obvious with diabetes. We use that as the easiest example, because you can measure your blood glucose. You take the carbs out, your blood glucose management improves. It just happens because it's so obvious. That's obvious to me. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's such a good point. The latest study that is quote unquote study that came out that was like, if replacing animal proteins with plant proteins will reduce your risk of dementia by nearly 20%. Well, it was 13%, so it wasn't nearly 20%. And it's the same as what you're saying. It's a relative risk versus an absolute risk. The numbers are tiny. And the picture that made the headline on CNN was all these like beautiful ribeye steaks. Well, when in the study, what they considered red meat was bacon, bologna, and hot dogs. So
Yeah.
it's just so misleading. It's such a
Yes.
shitty misleading title with a picture of something that they're not even measuring. And so yeah, it is misinformation. It's really terrible. I do want to talk to you about the blood sugar thing. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experiments with your continuous glucose monitor and some of the things you learned before we talk about the blood work that you did as well?
Yeah. Okay. Well, basically, I was so fed up with a few things coming up. Oh, that's healthy. Oatmeal's healthy. Bananas are healthy. Egg and bacon isn't that healthy. All that sort of stuff. So I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll just do a live experiment and I'll eat those things. I think the most interesting thing for me, and we're talking about how the physiology and how your taste buds, how your perception changes. That is a very. Let me take the lid off so people can clearly see. This is all unscripted, but I get asked about this a lot. So here it is. So here is, a fistful or handful of porridge oats, 40 grams of porridge oats. Nobody eats that small amount of oatmeal in the morning. But I
If you're
thought,
listening
well,
and not watching, it's like what, like a third of a cup, maybe a half of a quarter
yeah,
cup.
I could put it in my palm, couldn't I? I could
Yeah,
definitely.
you're right. Nobody eats that quantity.
No, right. They eat more. So I thought, I don't want to be accused of deliberately skewing the results. I will be absolutely, try to a good scientist tries to prove themselves wrong. That's actually what they should be doing, right? So I put 20 grams into the mix because I wanted to work out how much honey. Stick with me, Casey. I wanted to know how much honey I needed to add and banana because I used to have to add those things to make it palatable. So I wanted to work out. I didn't want to do too much honey, too much banana. So people go, "Wow, that's obviously going to raise your blood glucose." So I did 20 grams, and I took a bite, and it was too sweet without those things. Too sweet. From my memory, it was like I'd never be able to eat porridge like this without the fruit and the honey. So I did the experiment with just 20 grams, 20 grams of oats with nothing else. And it spiked my blood glucose. I think it went up to about 132 milligrams per deciliter.
Wow.
It went up. It went up really sharp. And then I let it calm down. So we had the huge trough. And then I added 5 slices of banana, not even a whole banana, and 1 teaspoon of honey. And that went up to about 160, 170 milligrams per deciliter, So then I did a live experiment where, I had my continual glucose monitor so people could see I hadn't, tried to fake the test, and I had a banana and we just watched it go up, to about 132 milligrams per deciliter, one banana. Now, you mentioned I won a singles tennis tournament. When people watch the top rated players, they might notice they have a banana, but if they're clever and they're looking at the science, they don't eat a whole banana. Even when I was a high carb advocate, I was told by my coach, don't eat the whole banana. That's way too much. Just nibble the banana. So they know that is bad, right? Well, that whole banana pushed my blood glucose up so much you would not believe it. So then I just did scrambled egg and bacon, and I didn't get a spike at all, really. I mean, it was nothing to see. In fact, my carnivore days, as I said at the time, sorry guys, this is really boring. There's nothing to see here. It's almost like a flat line, which is how interesting this program is going to be because it's flat. So I just tried all the things that are supposedly going to be good for you, and they weren't. It really is that simple. And things like a Snickers bar was less offensive than a banana, and it's just crazy when you look at it like that. So it was a good experiment. So like I say, I did it for 2 weeks. I've got nice graphics from it. I use the lingo if people are interested. It's not a very big brand, but it's good in the UK. The lingo CGM. I'm not selling it. I've got no affiliation. I've got a 10% discount code. I don't get any commission for it, but and it was really good. But it was particularly good to do the carnivore foods in relation, and also timings. I did some in the morning, some in the evening, some midday, and it's led me to one YouTube channel, which does frustrate me ever such a lot, which has got 750,000 people watching, and they just can't make the link that the carbs the guy is eating are the problem. So every day he eats something and he shows what does it do to my blood glucose, and then he sort of fakes how it's red, because you can see that he's got a band where it's 190 milligrams per deciliter, and he only says anything above that is a spike. Well, actually 119 milligrams per deciliter is quite high. I mean, a lot of people on carnivore will be 80. So you've already got an arbitrary sort of, we'll ignore that. So when he was eating steel cut oats, which I even tried when I used to believe in high carb, thinking it was good for me. He didn't say, oh, it's gone up to 100, and I can't remember exactly, but it hasn't gone up to 150 milligrams per deciliter, which it had. He said, oh, it's an extra 32 milligrams per deciliter, extra 32. Well, it isn't an extra 32. It's 119 plus 32. So you're talking about 150 milligrams per deciliter. But I don't like that, because that's misleading. That's sort of trying to lessen the effect. And that is one of the things I want to get away from. If it's that, tell people that's what it is. And then he does things to try and make the spike not so bad by adding protein, adding fat. And it's, well, adding protein didn't make much difference. Well, firstly, we haven't got what happened afterwards, really, which would be important. When do you get back to baseline? What is going on, 2 hours later, 3 hours later? And secondly, why not do some tests where there's no carbs? Well, he won't do that, because it won't go above 119 and it will defeat the whole object. And I really dislike that, because that's not helping people with diabetes. It's not helping people with blood glucose management problems. And it drives me wild. Can you tell? It really does. So that was my experiment.
Man, so that's fascinating, your experiment with the CGM. And I just have to say, subjectively, you must have been absolutely miserable going back on the carbohydrates. I can't imagine how hungry and how terrible those glucose surges and crashes were afterwards. That must have felt absolutely terrible.
Awful.
Oh, I'm sure. It sounds awful. I'm curious to hear your opinions about the blood work piece on carnivore. It's so cool that you decided to write a book about that. And there's people in our space that say that getting blood work done is really almost kind of irrelevant. It's tricky, because when you're getting blood work and trying to look at metrics, the blood is always changing. It's trafficking. It literally is where things traffic in the blood. And so, your traffic on the street is always changing depending on the day and the time. And especially in the context of carnivore, numbers are going to be different than they're going to be for general population. So I'd love to hear about the book that you wrote and some of the things you learned about the markers that you find a lot of value in, and whether or not somebody should be checking their blood and getting some of this stuff measured.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was quite surprised at. So when I started out, I did private blood testing, and basically drew the blood. I trained to be a phlebotomist because I wanted to know the whole process. I wanted to do it all from sort of the ground up. I wanted everything, and what I was finding was the doctor's comments that were coming back from the lab didn't match up with the people a lot of the times. And somebody said to me, you want to treat the person, not the numbers. And that's always stuck with me. And that's something I do say, because symptoms are actually the king. If you've got low folate, but no symptoms of low folate, is it an issue? That's the question. Have you got bleeding gums? Are you fatigued? Are you looking to get pregnant? They're important questions about the person and the lifestyle before you say to someone that's low, that's troublesome, you need to supplement or whatever. So I found it really interesting to continually encounter alleged highs and lows where people weren't showing any issues. For instance, iron overload, allegedly with carnivore, is just not shown in the bloods. Another one, and it's the biggest one really, which is the HbA1c, which is a terrible marker, an absolutely terrible marker once you start eating this way. And it's also, all this next thing is all provable. So when it goes up, people start to panic. Unless they're eating this way, I would panic. If they were eating a high carb diet, I think, oh yeah, that's really bad, even though there are things you can do to see why that's happening, even in that situation. But let's keep this nice and simple. Your red blood cells have a period of time where they're going to live. That's the assumption. So when you do an HbA1c reading, that isn't a reading. It's not a direct measurement. It's a calculation with an assumption. So when I started, I was told if you get a very low HbA1c, you have to check if the person is hemolytic anemic. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? Well, it means their red blood cells die too soon, and therefore it throws the calculation out. Okay. Now, I remembered that, and I thought, well, if we suddenly get an artificially high one, probably the red blood cells are living longer than is expected. So it's in the mainstream medicine about the lower, but not about the higher. Now, there is a thing that shows whether your red blood cells are lasting longer. It's called the reticulocyte count, which I now include for people that are worried about their HbA1c. There's also continual glucose monitors, and also people getting their fasted glucose, C-peptide, and their fasted insulin measured. So I was getting people that were, had a continual glucose monitor. The average was great, or even people doing the finger pricking, saying, this is amazing. Every single day, my blood glucose is 80. It's fantastic. Or the continual glucose monitor showing this great average. And then they go and get labs, and their HbA1c is whatever it is, 5.8 or 6 or something like that. And they go, it doesn't make any sense. And that is the key. It doesn't make any sense if you don't understand the context of the test and what you're eating. So if every single day you have a very low average blood glucose, the HbA1c must be wrong, especially if you measure your fasted insulin, fasted glucose, your C-peptide. You've got to look at, well, why is it wrong? Because it's a calculation. That's why it's wrong, because it's assuming that your red blood cells are dying at, after whatever the lab is using, 90 days, 120 days, whatever they're using in their calculations. If you do a reticulocyte count, that is the immature red blood cells coming directly from your bone marrow. And this is what always happens. If someone has that situation, they are definitely producing less red blood cells because they're so healthy from this environment of the way we're eating. Now, this might sound boring. I don't know if I've grabbed you, but the next thing is it has a knock-on effect, because what happens with your iron? Hemoglobin is heme and globin, right? When your red blood cells die, if you've got, say, 180 million red blood cells breaking down a minute, and all of a sudden it's 120 million a minute, it's actually more than that, but just to make the sums really easy, you've suddenly got 60 million a minute not being recycled. So you've got a huge amount of heme not coming back into the body. So what will happen there? Well, the body will change its ferritin level because it's suddenly detected incoming heme iron. And by the way, 90% of our iron in our body is coming from recycled blood cells. It's not coming from food. Food has a very small effect on the iron in our body. So hence me talk about iron overload. It's not a big issue on carnivore. Red blood cell turnover is. So what happens? The body senses there's less recycling of heme from the hemoglobin, from the red blood cells, because they're living longer. Therefore, it puts its ferritin up. So you suddenly tick another box. I would always make people understand that they need the full iron panel as well. The TIBC, UIBC. There's things you can get, your serum iron, ferritin, transferrin, saturation. All those things all help to build a picture. But once you understand that, you can then get into other things, because it has a knock-on effect on so many other things. In fact, all the markers that tend to be problematic for people either involve not understanding processes in the body when there's not so many carbs coming in, or just not understanding it's a calculation. So the EGFR, when you look at the filtration rate of the kidney, the E is estimated. We even know that it is an estimate because it says if you're this nationality, we reckon it's filtering at this rate. If you're different, it's this rate. So we're knowing it's not an actual measurement of filtration, it's a calculation. Well, the calculation is based on the creatinine. Well, if you eat more protein, you have more creatinine, which is a waste product of protein metabolism. So your EGFR looks lower. So it looks like your kidneys are getting tanked. That's the expression people use. But when you do a proper test called the cystatin C test, you see that you haven't got a problem because you've taken the calculation out. So here we've got now we've got the iron overload thing ticked off, HbA1c ticked off, EGFR ticked off, all different under this way of eating, all completely different. So then you get the, well, my T3 is going to tank. No, it's lower on this way of eating. I think I explained it earlier in this interview. Because we're not taking pyruvate across the mitochondrial membrane, which needs a lot of T3. We also don't need so much vitamin C, again, as I was saying, because we don't need to convert non-heme iron to heme. So all of these numbers, they're big numbers. Big as in people pick up on them and worry about them. And then there's also idiots that say, oh, this low level of insulin, that's going to be a problem long term. You need to keep boosting your insulin. Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. Where's that come from? Based on what? Where's that come from? It's just people speculating who don't know, because they're looking at normative ranges and going, oh, that's low. No, it's not low. It's low in the context of 45 to 65% carbohydrates. But in this way of eating, that's really good. So I'm sounding a little bit like I'm ranting. Sorry, it's just something I'm passionate about, because people get scared and they go off this way of eating because someone's gone, that number's wrong. It's got a red flag. It's too low. It's too high. No, it isn't. It's appropriate for this way of eating. So hence I wrote the book. And, there's a big section on LDL, LP little a, ApoB, all the misconceptions around that. So, yeah. And oxidized LDL, that's another one. Luckily, I had a client that had, enough money to be able to do really regular blood testing to prove this. There's a test called PLAC, the plaque test, or plaque 2, and it looks at an enzyme, and it's allegedly associated with cardiovascular events. And if that's high, it means you're really going to have a problem. But the function of the enzyme that it's testing is to degrade oxidized LDL. And there we go. So that guy actually had that test at my recommendation and did have high levels of oxidized LDL. And I said, that has been flagged, but it's probably doing its job. It's probably high because it's going to tackle your oxidized LDL. 3 months later, that oxidized LDL, which was in the thousands, was down to like 300 in the green. Well, how did that happen? Because the guy didn't change his diet. He was already carnivore. Well, I'll tell you how that happened. The enzyme that the plaque test 2 looks at was elevated, doing its job, degrading it. So I think it's just understanding it a little bit more than just looking at the numbers and saying, oh, that's out of range. That's low, that's high. You've got to medicate, or you've got to take this supplement, because invariably that isn't what you need to do. You need to just understand the context and, look at your symptoms. If you've got symptoms, that's a different kettle of fish. But you shouldn't just change because a number is not where allegedly it should be.
Wow, that is amazing. Stephen, your rants are
I think you're muted, or my sound's gone. Hang on, Casey.
Yeah, your rants are more than welcome on our show, my friend. That was so well explained. And you hear concerns about this all the time with people who are getting blood work done. They feel amazing. Everything seems to be getting better on carnivore, but now they've got these big red numbers on their blood labs and they're really concerned about it. The ferritin one is a huge one. All of these things are really important. So I'm really glad that you wrote that book. We'll be sure to tag that in the notes so people can access that. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, tell us about the concept of carnivore-a-thon and what made you decide to do carnivore-a-thon, and if you're going to continue doing that in the future.
Well, that's a brilliant way that you pronounce that, because many people have trouble with it.
I have a tough time saying it. I practiced it offline with you a few times, and that helped.
Well, yeah, about 2 years ago, I think what happened was that we wanted to have, just an easy way of getting out to people and doing something that will get a little bit of traction. So that's what we did. We decided to do a 24-hour live stream. Just get up on I can't remember. I think it was a Sunday morning, 8 o'clock, and just round to Monday morning, 8 o'clock, and just get loads of guests in and just literally do 24 hours. And that was myself and Richard Smith, the Keto Pro. I think I mentioned him earlier. We do the school community together. And that's how we really sort of started to bond. And what we learned was, firstly, we couldn't have done that when we were high carb advocates. We would need breakfast, food, drinks, whatever, all the time. But I actually stood for the whole 24 hours. I'm sitting now because it's just more fun. But, it was actually pretty easy. It's not being big-headed. And then we sort of enjoyed it. It wasn't the best thing in the world to do, but we did sort of enjoy it. And then the next thing we did was think, should we do it again? So we did it again. And then we've now got a lot of pressure to make it an annual thing. But Richard is also the guy that, Richard with a couple of other people set up the Carnivore Conference, the first one in the UK. So maybe we'll do that and the 24-hour. We don't know yet. That's the honest answer. We don't know what we're going to do, but possibly we'll do another one.
Well, regardless of whether it comes back or not, that was monumental in the carnivore community. So kudos to you for doing it. People still talk about it to this day. And so it was an amazing event. And yeah, just exactly what you said. Like, there's no chance we could have done this on a high carbohydrate diet. That is absolutely true. And to know that you were standing the whole time, we learned that from Richard as well. Like, that's absolutely epic. And it was monumental in the community. So congratulations on doing that. It's something that lives on, regardless of whether you continue to do it annually or take a year off.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. I think, it's quite expensive to do. We can't do any consultations that day. And then also, we didn't stay awake for 24 hours. We stayed awake for longer because, 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday, I just work. So we probably did 48 hours, maybe.
Yeah,
but anyway,
that's what Richard said.
without any sleep, which is not good when you're a health advocate. Sleep is so important. So shot ourselves in the foot a bit. Yeah.
Good call. Again, either way, if you bring it back or not, when you did it the first time, it was absolutely epic. And this has been an awesome chat. I've really enjoyed catching up with you. You've been very, very busy. I love the way you've dove into, kind of helping to educate and shed some light on some things that a lot of people are very confused about. It's always just a joy to talk to you, Stephen. Where can people go to find you and connect with you and your work?
The website is the ukcarnivore.com. I'm on Spotify with the Carnivore Experience podcast, which is good, and also on YouTube you can find me, Stephen Thomas, Bachelor of Science with Honours or something like that, or Coach Stephen. You'll find me on YouTube. And the school community is SKOOL, the schoolcommunity.com, and it's low carb school, Richard Smith and myself.
Excellent. We will link to all of that in the show notes. And like I said, this is an absolute joy to catch up with you. Thank you so very much for all of your hard work. Can you remind us actually what the name of the book is as well?
Yeah, Guide to Blood Tests in the Context of Low Carb, Keto, and Carnivore.
Perfect. We'll link that as well. Like I said, just a joy to catch up with you. Thank you so very much for making the time and coming back on the show today and sharing your wisdom with us. I certainly learned a lot, and I know our watchers and listeners will as well. So again, thank you so very much, Stephen. We really, really appreciate you.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's an honor. I think the work you're doing is just amazing. I just love what you're doing, and you work so hard, and you deserve to be more successful. To be honest, you need to get a bigger audience because the information you're putting out is just quality. So I take my hat off to you.
Thank you very much for the kind words. That really means a lot coming from you. So thank you again, and thank you for coming on our show today. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.